Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast, where
Yeah.
we take you on journeys through the lives of some of the most fascinating figures in history.
Mhm.
And today,
Yeah.
we're strapping in for a wild ride through the world of e-commerce, space travel, and even a little bit of Hollywood.
Buckle up.
That's right.
It's going to be a bumpy ride.
We're diving deep into the life and career of Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos, a name that's pretty much synonymous with the internet age, right?
I mean, you can't really talk about one without the other at this point, can you?
From starting in a garage to becoming, well, kind of a mythical figure, His story really reflects how crazy ambitious, how risky, how fast everything's been in the digital world.
It's like the whole internet revolution personified almost.
Exactly. And we're not just going to look at the business moves he made, but what they tell us about where we're all headed.
It's like a real-life tech thriller, full of twists and turns, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
And it all starts with a pretty unusual beginning, right?
You could say that.
Born to a teenage mom, adopted by a Cuban immigrant engineer. I mean, you don't hear that kind of origin story every day.
No, not every day. And think about his childhood, too. Like, on one hand, you've got the discipline of engineering from his adoptive father,
Right.
but then you've also got the risk-taking spirit you need to run a ranch. He was splitting his time between the city life of Houston and Miami and then these wide-open spaces of his grandparents' Texas ranch.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, did that mix of urban hustle and that wide open space, did that shape how he thinks? Did that give him an appetite for tackling these big unconventional things?
It's fascinating to consider. And speaking of unconventional, did you know about this little detail from his childhood?
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
So Bezos, he was already an inventor, even as a kid. He rigged this electric alarm to keep his siblings out of his room.
Classic.
Talk about early signs of ingenuity. It's like a real-life Home Alone situation. And then here's another thing that really foreshadows his future. In his high school graduation speech, he talked about colonizing space, turning Earth into a national park, while humanity heads for the stars.
That's wild. So he was already thinking about this stuff back then.
It wasn't just teenage sci-fi dreaming.
All right.
It was a preview of what he'd do with Blue Origin decades later.
So from a young age, he had these big dreams, this ambition that just knew no bounds. But before we get to the rockets and spaceships, we got to talk about Amazon, right?
The mothership.
Picture this. A Wall Street hotshot quits his job, hops in a car with his wife, and writes Amazon's business plan on a cross-country road trip.
Ah, the classic entrepreneur story.
It's peak 90s entrepreneur, wouldn't you say?
It's the anything is possible energy of that era captured perfectly. But it's easy to forget, back then, Amazon was just changing online books.
Right.
It was revolutionary at the time, but who could have predicted what it would become?
It's hard to imagine now, but yeah, it was a niche thing back then. And get this, it wasn't even called Amazon at first. You wanted to call it Cadabra, like the magician's phrase.
Cadabra?
Can you imagine?
Abracadabra.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thankfully, someone told him it sounded too much like cadaver.
Oh, wow. Yeah, not a great look for a company trying to sell you things.
Definitely not the best association for your brand.
So why Amazon?
Well, there were two reasons, actually.
Oh.
First, alphabetically, it put them at the top of website listings
Oh, smart. Yeah. Back when those actually mattered.
back in the day.
Right.
And second, it evoked the scale he was aiming for. The Amazon River, the largest river in the world. Soon to be, well, the largest everything store. It's a pretty bold vision.
It was. But to achieve that vision, he needed more than just a good name.
Exactly. And that's where Bezos' leadership really comes in. It wasn't just about being in the right place at the right time. It was about how he ran the company. So what was it about his approach that made such a difference?
Well, there's this famous story from Amazon's early days. Bezos would have printouts of customer feedback scattered all over his office floor.
Really?
He'd literally walk on them, making himself and his team confront what people were saying, good or bad. This wasn't some abstract idea of the customer. It was right there in their faces every single day.
That's hardcore. It's like he was building this feedback loop into the DNA of the company, right?
Exactly. He was obsessed with data, always putting the customer first, willing to make these huge bets. And this get big fast mentality was almost unheard of back then.
And it worked. They survived the dot-com bubble burst when so many others, well, they just flamed out.
Yeah, they went down in flames.
And then came AWS, Kindle,
Mhm.
each move basically reshaping a whole industry.
Each one was a huge gamble.
And it paid off. But before we go any further into Bezos land, I just want to remind everyone
Yes.
to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the rest of this Bezos bonanza
Yes, please do.
and all the other fascinating stories we have on Tell Me More.
We'll be right back after a short break.
So we've talked about his childhood, those unconventional beginnings,
Right.
and the incredible rise of Amazon. But Amazon was just the beginning, wasn't it?
It was never going to be enough. I mean, he had those space ambitions since he was a kid, remember? And that's where Blue Origin comes in.
It's like the ultimate passion project, right?
Huh.
Turning a childhood fascination into, well, rockets blasting off.
The mission of Blue Origin is twofold, really. On the one hand, it's about making space travel more accessible,
Okay.
which, sounds very Bezos, right?
Mhm.
Taking something exclusive and making it mainstream.
Kind of like what he did with online shopping.
Exactly. But then there's this other layer to it, a more ambitious one, establishing a permanent human presence beyond Earth. It's straight out of those sci-fi novels he loved as a kid.
And of course, he had to write his own rocket, right?
Of course.
Can't just be the guy who builds them, right?
Right. Gotta write him too. There's definitely a look what I did element to it.
Hmm.
And that 2021 flight, 9 days after Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic flight, there was a billionaire space race vibe going on.
Though, to be fair, Bezos insists it's all about saving Earth by moving heavy industry off-planet.
Saving the planet one rocket launch at a time.
It sounds pretty far out there, I gotta say.
It's a long-term vision, for sure. And whether you believe it or not, it shows how Bezos thinks, right? On a time scale most of us can't even comprehend.
It's mind-boggling when you think about it. Okay, so we've got e-commerce, space travel, but then there's the Washington Post.
Ah, yes, the media mogul chapter.
Buying a major newspaper. That's a
Huh.
bit of a curveball.
It's interesting, right? Because it shows how willing he is to step outside the purely tech world and into something with a lot of cultural and political weight.
Let's be honest, owning the Washington Post gives you a level of influence that even billions can't buy directly.
That's true, and there has been some controversy about that,
Like what?
Potential conflicts of interest, accusations of using the paper to push his own agenda.
I see.
Bezos denies any meddling, of course, but, well, we can leave that for you to ponder.
And let's not forget all those other investments he has.
Yeah.
Bezos Expeditions is like a window into his brain.
It's like a sneak peek into his thoughts.
From investing in Google way back when to this cutting-edge life extension research. It's like he's hedging his bets on the future.
Trying to cover all the bases.
It makes you wonder, what does the world's richest man think is coming next?
Right. That's the question, isn't it? I mean, the guy became the first centibillionaire, exceeding even Bill Gates at his peak. It's a level of wealth that's almost impossible to grasp.
And that hasn't come without criticism, of course.
Oh, absolutely.
People point to Amazon's labor practices, how warehouse workers are treated, and they ask, why isn't he donating billions like Gates or Buffett?
Those are valid questions. I mean, Bezos stepped up his philanthropy in recent years, with the Bezos Earth Fund, donations to various causes, but it's still a fraction of his wealth.
Right. And then there's the man himself, his public persona,
Yeah.
from that geeky CEO in the early days to this kind of imposing, almost villainous figure.
Like, remember those SNL skits with him as a power-hungry Bond villain?
Exactly.
It's fascinating how his image has changed because it reflects how we've come to view big tech in general. All that initial optimism about the internet has given way to more questioning of its power and the people who wield it. Bezos has almost become a symbol of that whole shift.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
A lot of ground.
Bezos, the entrepreneur, the space enthusiast, the media mogul, even the potential supervillain. What does it all add up to?
That's the million-dollar question, or rather the $100 billion question in this case.
Right.
And there's no easy answer. What's clear is that Jeff Bezos is one of the most consequential figures of our time. But whether that's ultimately for good or bad, well, that's up to each of us to decide.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
A question for the ages, for sure. Hero or villain? Or is it, like it usually is, somewhere in between?
Right, right. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. I mean, we've thrown a lot at you. The early years, Amazon's rise, the space race, all the controversies. But figuring out what you think about Bezos, his impact, his legacy, that's the challenge.
It's easy to get caught up in those headlines. Either he's this amazing visionary or he's this ruthless tycoon. But taking a step back, weighing the evidence, realizing how complex it all is, that's what makes you, informed, right? Not just someone passively absorbing info.
And to do that, you got to ask the tough questions. Like,
Right.
when we say Bezos wants to make space travel more accessible, Do we really mean accessible to everyone? Or is it still just a playground for the super rich?
Yeah, good point. A ticket on Blue Origin. Still astronomically expensive, pun intended. So it does make you wonder who really benefits from all this. And are we really tackling the problems that are right here, right now, on Earth?
You mentioned earlier, Bezos talks about saving Earth by moving heavy industry off-planet. But isn't that just kicking the can down the road? What about the environmental impact of launching all those rockets?
Sure.
And who gets to decide which industries go to space and which ones stay here?
All excellent questions. And they highlight why we need to think critically about these big, grand visions. It's exciting, sure, space exploration, but we can't forget the potential downsides. The intended A and D, the unintended ones.
It's like that saying, with great power comes great responsibility. And Bezos, well, he's got a lot of both, wouldn't you say?
For sure. And that brings us to another really interesting thing about Bezos, him buying the Washington Post. That move sparked a lot of debate.
It was bold, that's for sure. Some people loved it, saying he's investing in journalism when the industry is struggling. But others, they worried about conflicts of interest, maybe him using the paper for his own benefit.
Bezos said he bought it out of a sense of duty, believing in a free press. But Critch pointed out that owning a big paper gives him a platform to shape public opinion. And that could help his businesses, right?
It's tricky, no doubt.
Yeah.
Billionaire with possible vested interests owning a major newspaper. But on the flip side, a struggling industry needing help. Where do you draw the line?
That's the question, isn't it? No easy answers. It comes back to thinking for yourself, considering different viewpoints, and then forming your own conclusions.
And it's not just the Washington Post. Bezos has all these other investments through Bezos Expeditions, backing Google early on, funding life extension research. It's clear he's thinking about the long game, betting on what's next.
His investments are like a glimpse into his mind. What does he see coming down the line? And given his track record, it's worth paying attention.
Speaking of the long game, let's talk about the elephant in the room, Bezos' wealth. He was the first to hit over $100 billion, right? It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of money.
It's an amount that has really sparked debate about inequality. What role do billionaires play in society? Is it even ethical to have that much?
Some say he's a self-made man, earned it through hard work, innovation. He should do what he wants with his money. Others say his wealth comes from a system that favors the super rich. He's got a moral obligation to give back.
And then there's the question of how he uses that wealth. Bezos has given more to philanthropy lately, climate change, education, but it's still a small percentage compared to, say, Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, who've pledged to give away most of their fortunes.
So what's the verdict? Visionary leader who changed how we live and work. Ruthless tycoon who got rich at the expense of workers and the environment.
You decide. We've laid out the facts, the different viewpoints, how complicated it all is. Now it's up to you to weigh the evidence and make up your own mind.
And this is where the deep dive gets really interesting. It's not about finding the right answer. It's about thinking critically, challenging what you assume, and coming to your own conclusions.
And don't forget, the conversation doesn't stop here. There's always more to learn, more to explore, more to question.
Keep digging, keep reading, keep thinking, and maybe you'll come up with your own answer about who Jeff Bezos really is and what his legacy will be.
And if this has made you curious, well, hit that subscribe button. Hear more fascinating deep dives on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast.
It really is amazing when you think about it, how much just one person can shape, the world we live in. And with Bezos, it's not just the companies, the wealth, it's the ideas too. The future he seems to be pushing for.
It is, yeah. And we've talked about his drive, ambition, that long-term thinking he has. But those qualities, they can go in so many directions. It makes you think, if you had that kind of influence, what would you focus on? What kind of mark would you want to leave behind?
That's like a thought experiment, right? If you had all those resources, would you be like Bezos, going for space exploration? Or would you focus on problems here on Earth? Like, I don't know, poverty or hunger or diseases.
And how would you handle all the ethical stuff that comes with it? We talked about Amazon's workers, data privacy, big tech maybe getting too powerful. If you were in charge, how would you balance making new stuff with being responsible?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah.
No easy answers there. But that's kind of why we wanted to bring them to you in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're not here to give you all the solutions. More like to, spark your curiosity, get you thinking about the world and how we shape it,
Remember that image of Bezos walking on those customer feedback printouts? It wasn't just about data, right?
Yeah.
It was about staying grounded, thinking about how his choices affected people. That's something we can all learn from no matter how ambitious we are.
Totally. Whether you're building some huge company or just trying to make a difference in your own little corner of the world, you got to think about the consequences, the ripple effects, things that go way beyond just you.
And it's not always about the big flashy stuff either. Sometimes the biggest changes come from small things, acts of kindness, new ideas, or even just asking the right questions.
So, as we wrap up this Bezos deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. What do you think his legacy will be? Will he be remembered as, like, this visionary pushing the limits of what humans can do? Or a symbol of big tech's power, maybe?
Or maybe, like, we've been talking about something much more complicated. A mix of good and bad successes and failures, a reflection of, well, how messy everything is.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to decide how we see his impact, what he did right, what he did wrong, and maybe more importantly, how we use all that to make our own choices do our own thing. Try to make things better.
Because really, that's what matters most. Not just the stories we tell, but the stories we choose to live ourselves.
And on that note, we'll leave you to it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Jeff Bezos. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more fascinating deep dives on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.